I think it's going to be worthwhile looking at the document because we haven't got a lot of room to move. The two main components of the document is about the current situation, a short statement, it's only a longish paragraph, and currently 8 recommendations. So I think the two potentials that I see in the current situation make some quite strong statements about what we think is important, and try to include either have a separate additional recommendation for freshwaters or add some words on some of the other statements. And of course, I think one of the things is probably to look at the whole flavour of the current document and align ourselves with others who might be promoting a different flavour. And I think one of the things coming across is that there's practically nothing about biodiversity outcomes, nothing about monitoring in this document. There's a very strong emphasis on the management effectiveness based on measuring actions. So I think that's something. The other issue is about, now there are some statements about habitat conversion in protected areas. I mean, that's a really serious issue in terms of conservation outcomes. Yet there isn't a recommendation about that. And in relation to wetlands and the issues that Jamie was talking about, habitat conversion, you know, the kind of habitats in protected areas that are supposed to protect biodiversity are disappearing without necessarily being registered as either a major change in management of the protected areas or loss of effectiveness. So I think those are the kind of things we should be focusing on.
Okay. Okay, yeah. So I think the one thing that I would really like to achieve then is this part 5, the recommendations to the IUCN's World Parks Congress, of which you say there are 8 recommendations. So the header is simply, in this section, describe 10 to 15 core outcomes of the stream that will guide future practice. Each statement assumes that it begins with "it is recommended that," and there's an action and timing component to that. Looking through these, I'm just looking to see if there's anything, if there's a component where I can immediately see something that we can tack onto. But I'm more inclined to say, then let's right now, Jamie, let's right now define what our recommendation would be.
Ian, can I suggest that we could be fairly simple, direct and blunt in that when you wander around the pavilion over there, it's full of words about terrestrial and marine protected areas, and the freshwater biome is completely missing out. Now, the Convention on Biological Diversity sets targets, quantified targets for conservation of inland waters biodiversity. It's IUCN that is not with the main game, and I think perhaps it would be wise for us to focus on a statement which simply says to IUCN, it's about time that you recognise, act on, measure, count, promote the conservation of the freshwater biome in the same way as you are doing for marine and terrestrial.
Yeah, definitely. Does anyone? Yeah. Let me.
I can yell.
Well, it's. Yeah, all right. This is being recorded, so it might help for the camera.
If I speak fast, can I make 2 comments? One on what we were saying before about setting priorities, just because it's so patchy the knowledge we have about freshwater biodiversity. For example, in the area where we work, it took 60 days to do a fairly complete inventory of birds. The inventory of fish took 11 years. So a suggestion, could we be using top aquatic predators as indicators and as one of the things that we look at when we're setting priorities. For example, otters, crocodilians, freshwater dolphins, large catfish, and others. These species, they tend to respond to overfishing, they respond to all kinds of human pressures, they bioaccumulate all kinds of contaminants in the water and might show up before in them and in other species. So a suggestion where you don't have knowledge of what fish species are present, for instance, to try to focus on the larger top predators that are easier to inventory. My second point has to do with the role of strictly protected Category 1 and 2 freshwater areas. For example, in our experience in the Brazilian Amazon, in terms of fisheries management in a river, we're finding it's far more effective to have a strictly protected area acting as a no fishing zone and then let people fish outside it than to try to regulate the fishery in the entire river with all sorts of restrictions. This is more difficult, both in a theoretical level, because then you need to have in-depth knowledge of the biology of all these species that you want to manage. And it's difficult on a practical level, because then you have to have enforcement capacity to apply all these complex regulations, where it's a lot more practical to set up a reserve where fishing is not allowed, and that reserve will restock fish populations outside it, regardless of how managed or mismanaged the fishery is taking place. So the value of strictly protected freshwater areas.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's something that Tracy, effectively is what you've been doing in Tonle Sab, isn't it? Yeah. Holly, go ahead.
Just building off that, I want to say, there's been a lot of work to set up fish conservation zones, which sounds similar to what you're talking about, just a completely closed zone, but there hasn't been any work to assess whether they're actually effective or not in creating spillover, and I've looked all through the literature. I can't find very many good examples or references of how do we evaluate the effectiveness of a freshwater protected area that's designed to enhance fish populations. There's a great deal of literature for marine protected areas, but not for freshwater. So I think that's something that needs more work. And I just wanted to also say that if our goal is to measure outcomes, we can't give up on monitoring. I know it can be time consuming and expensive, and it's very hard to get funding for monitoring, but maybe that's something that we need to promote more or explain more to the higher level decision makers and donors of, we can't tell them that their money is being put to good use if they don't support monitoring.
Okay. Good. Yeah.
Yes, I just want to build up also on the comments about protected areas. And this morning I presented a series of case studies all over the world about vanishing species and the significance of protected areas, strictly protected areas, in preserving them. I just want to add to this group a very interesting data, that I ran into, just published by the Zoological Society of London, and that says that recently freshwater species are vanishing. 76% of all freshwater species are vanishing. So I think that's a very important piece of information that we should include in our considerations here.
Yeah.
Index.
Yeah.
Yes, yes. Oh, yes.
Okay, thanks for, you.
I want to blow in the same horn a little bit. In contrast to terrestrial and marine, we are really facing also extinctions all the time. We keep up an actual list of extinct freshwater fishes from the Western Palearctics. So everything what is west of the Urals, including Iran. And actually each year we update the list for 1 or 2 additional extinct species we discover. So it's really from year to year that we have 1 or 2 more extinct species. And this is very different from the marine, where it's mostly about economies, fisheries, livelihoods, hardly any of these extinct fishes supported any livelihoods.
I think I could add that it's very unusual for a fishery to extinguish a marine species biologically. You can extinguish it commercially. With freshwater species, we have evidence that they can't extinguish it. You can catch the last fish with a fishery.
Yeah. So I will add something here. So to add to Jamie's point, which has kind of stimulated these points, then I think so. If we're talking, if a recommendation is that the IUCN has to act on, to support, promote, act on potential the conservation of freshwater ecosystems in the same way that it does for terrestrial and marine systems. Then I think perhaps thinking back to yesterday and to Dirk, your comment about the fact that we do not have that freshwater line on for monitoring the development of freshwater protected areas. Then one of the, as part of this recommendation, it should be we should act on, do the things that we need to do in order to create that, to have the data to be able to monitor the change. So in the recommendations they ask, they suggest an action. Well, there are plenty of actions and timing. What do people feel about, like, if we're saying for timing, I think it would seem to me that recommendation for IUCN to be more proactive is something which should happen. So we should be part of the process of leading up, I guess, to the next Congress as a priority action statement for that. Yeah, Jamie.
IUCN has signed up to the Convention on Biological Diversity's IHA targets, and my memory of the precise numbers is a little fuzzy, but I think it was 17% of freshwater habitats to be reserved by 2020, and there were some additional targets as well. So I wonder if that provides a target and a timeline, or a number of targets and timelines.
It certainly provides the timeline. I mean, in fact, it's 17%, but not fresh water. It's so I think, and that's something else I would add to this recommendation, is that it's defined in terms of I forget whether it's even, but I think it's just terrestrial.
The target level is 70% of inland and terrestrial waters, but it doesn't say what part belongs to each other. It's both together. It's 17% of terrestrial and inland waters. That's what it says.
Right.
So it's mixing both together.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Yeah.
It doesn't specify how much is fresh water. It just say terrestrial and inland.
Yeah. So that the fresh water has to be defined, and I think actually, so again on the define to meet the 2020 targets, which would also actually be in line with to meeting Ramsar's 2021 target of the 50% reduction.
Just a reminder, when we communicate outside this room, we have to make clear that freshwater protected areas are not just for freshwater. When you talk to people, they seem to assume, okay, so it's to secure a supply of fresh water, from a city or for whatever downstream. And if the supply of fresh water is secure, then the area is successful. Well, we're trying to secure the biodiversity within the freshwater, right? Not just the water supply downstream. And yet when you say freshwater protected area, for most people, they think it's just for the water.
Mm-hmm. Simon.
If I can actually add to that, I think one of the things that we should make clear is, as well is that if we protect a freshwater protected area, then you also get the added benefit of protecting a terrestrial area at the same time. So it's not mutually exclusive. However, the other way around, if you target a terrestrial area, then the freshwater doesn't come with it automatically. So I think, I don't know how to frame that, but
Yeah, I just wanted to build on what you were saying, is that fresh water is not only a commodity, it's freshwater biodiversity, and that river isn't a river ecosystem, that there's variation within, because I think very often you'll see like grassland, forest, tundra, and then river, many other things, and I think we need to break that up and recognize the variation.
I mean, I agree with just about everything that's been said. I'm just a little bit concerned about finding the right way of getting results from this Congress, and you know, it's really about looking at in the recommendations what are the elements that can be developed, and of course. For Stream 1, the Stream 1 document is very firmly based on Aichi Target 11. And in Aichi Target 11, the percentage issue can be maybe broken down. We can address that, so we can think about how to do that. And the other elements, there's equity, and there's representativeness, and there's management effectiveness. So in some way, if we can pick up on the ideas that, you know, we discussed this session and yesterday's session about representativeness, and then all the discussion about upstream impacts and various other factors that make the management effectiveness issue somewhat a different thing for freshwaters than for terrestrial systems. If we can find a few words to bring in there in those recommendations that relate to those issues, I think we'll be more effective and have a greater chance of success.
Jamie.
Just looking at the wording of Target 11, there are the words well-connected systems integrated into the wider landscapes, and many of our esteemed forest colleagues are in other buildings talking about linking landscape projects that have beasties leaping from mountaintop to mountaintop, but ignoring the rivers as the natural corridors, the natural connection pathways through the landscape. And so I'm wondering, Erin, are there a few key words that we can put in there, picking up on the connectivity question about focusing on rivers as nature's natural connections through the landscape?
Definitely.
So, I mean, should we try it? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, if we're going to be picky about the words in Aichi 11, Target 11, I think it says also that all the categories are to be considered. 1 and 2, strictly protected areas, and also category 6, sustainable use protected areas, consistently with the protection of species. So we have to be, I think that's a key word there, that if we're going to use which categories are going to be more effective, I think we should emphasize that strict protected areas are more efficient in conserving species.
So when you're talking about the categories, you mean the
IUCN
categories?
Yeah. Strict protected areas versus sustainable use areas. And they say that sustainable use areas can be considered consistently, as long as they are consistent with the protection of species, among other things that have been said here. But I think that we can demonstrate that strict protected areas are more efficient in protecting at the species level.
So the recommendation there would be that Aichi targets should be explicit about the categories of protected areas that they are referring to, and should, wherever possible, be referring to those most strict protected areas.
Emphasizes that strict protected areas should be given priority. I say that because a lot of countries, it's all about area. nobody's really looking at effectiveness. There are a lot of subtleties in the Aichi Target 11 that are being overlooked. People are talking about 20%, 17%, and it's just like lines on a map. And sometimes, for example, if you consider several sustainable use areas that have been logged, in terms of terrestrial areas, could have been logged, or in freshwater areas could be lakes that have been overfished. Those, as long as you have a protected area, they would count for the Aichi target.
Yeah, right.
But I think that they shouldn't, because if they're not consistent with the protection of species, they should not be counted.
Okay, yeah. Okay, we've got eight minutes left. So maybe we're talking about having some wordage which works, which is, I like that, wordage which works. So maybe we should identify that right now in terms of talking about connectivity. So, because I don't want us all to kind of like go away thinking, yeah, great thoughts, and then Aaron and I write something down and you see it later and everyone goes, what the hell? So maybe it would be good just to kind of get some draft, a bit of wordage. Does that make sense to people? Yeah. Okay, good.
Yeah. Would it be useful to quickly touch on these recommendations, and if something really critical strikes, if you could just mention it? We can do it in 10 minutes, I think. Is that a good idea?
Yeah, for some we can do that, and I think just have our words before we leave.
Oh, okay, all right. Okay, there's a recommendation about the national biodiversity strategies, and recommendation to countries to take into account species and ecological condition in developing their biodiversity strategies. Is there a freshwater angle that we can put in there? I mean, it's generally national biodiversity strategies totally ignore freshwater biodiversity.
I think you might lose the power of the exercise by burying freshwater in each of the recommendations.
I agree. Yeah, I think actually, yeah, maybe we should just focus on having an explicit thing, yeah, rather than just kind of add fresh water to each thing. That's what you're recommending.
But what I'm hearing is that we're all kind of more than fed up that there's been largely ignored in the larger community, and we already have CBD, we already have REMSAR, so I don't think we want to get into specifics of what to do with either of those. But I like the way Jamie phrased it when he made his initial intervention. It's just better recognition, reporting, and getting the country delegates also to report their successes. And one of the very first statements that was shared in the opening session was, that's great, we protected X% of terrestrial and 3% marine.
We want equal emphasis for freshwater, the same emphasis terrestrial marine gets.
You know, there are many nuances and angles here, but when I agree, the way Jamie articulated is nice and concise, and if we want to get one message across, that's it. We can maybe add places largely fed up, you know, so that's the right.
We demand equal emphasis.
Yeah.
So to do that, don't we need to define which is the data set that we're going to use to assess the coverage? Because if you want to assess coverage by protected areas of freshwater systems, you need a layer that you're going to use as your baseline to say this is what is protected. I don't think we're going to be specific, but at some point someone has to do an analysis and say extraterrestrial, ex-marine, ex-freshwater, and for that you need a base layer. And
I think that is something which happens down the line. You know, like we get this statement, and then the next point is, what data do we use to achieve that? But for right now, maybe it's just getting this statement, and make sure that before everyone leaves, you capture those main points effectively. And another quick thing before we leave is an opportunity for us. There is another section which says gives Describe case studies that support the stream's contention that innovative approaches are likely to be successful when scaled up or disseminated. So that's another thing. Like, if we're making a recommendation, then it would be good to have an example of how this works. Jamie, again.
We have a number of innovative approaches. We've got a lot of people here who've worked on environmental flows. There's been some very good wetland restoration work in terms of removing unnecessary water infrastructure. There are examples of adding fish passages and thermal pollution control to dams. I think a number of people have mentioned things like free-flowing river reserves that have different names in different countries. They're all really good examples of innovative freshwater conservation that our terrestrial friends could usefully apply more widely.
Okay. All right. So just to get back to this, so our recommendation would be should include essentially the point that the IUCN should recognize support, act on, recognize support, promote, act on the conservation of freshwater ecosystems. Okay, that's one point.
The issue there, though, is whether it's not so much the strength of the language; it's who you're targeting. Because so far in none of the documents have I seen any recommendations targeting IUCN. The recommendations target countries, communities, private sector. They're fairly generic things. So, I think the question is, do we want to see our recommendation included rather than just maybe expressing our views? And I'd go for the former.
Well, I think our recommendation would be. I do tend to agree that actually this is a recommendation. I mean, it doesn't matter if it's not a kind of a regional or sort of thematic or regionally focused recommendation. I mean, it's a strong recommendation. The recommendation is that IUCN has to be more explicit about its recognition of fresh water. That's a powerful recommendation, and it's a recommendation everyone in this room just it feels the same way. It's like, oh my God, here we are again, and fresh water is not.
But the World Past Congress will be IUCN will be a part of that, making recommendation to the world. I don't think IUCN is the right target to identify in a sector.
So we recommend to the world to give equal emphasis.
Countries.
If we're talking about,
must give equal emphasis.
If we're talking about Target 11, then we should. It's a CBD. We're telling.
Yeah.
But the CBD is made up of national governments, and so can we, if IUCN's the problem, let's soften it to government and non-government conservation organisations, or something sufficiently broad but pointed.
Just have a look at the recommendation on page 5, number 3, under part 5. Just the wording of that. I'll just read it because I don't have it here.
So this is just an example. It is recommended that urgent attention is given by countries and the global and local communities to addressing the rising threats of, and this happens to do with biodiversity from wildlife crime, but could you not frame something like that around fresh water?
That's the kind of language that would be most effective and likely to be included.
I nominate you to draft that, Eric.
Simple, but...
So I think we do that, but also the two other points that came out then were that as part of that, it's necessary for IUCN or whoever to be more explicit about freshwater within that target 11 in terms of breaking it out, and that freshwater systems freshwater systems are the natural connectors between other ecosystems. And then I forget the kind of terminology that was from 11, which is talking about connectivity, but highlighting the critical role that freshwater ecosystems have as connectors. That should be another point. Is that fair? Reasonable? Yes.
Should we say something about representativeness? Because I suppose that's kind of something that really came out of the talk that I gave from Bernhard yesterday. That yes, some systems are, I think globally we had something like a 60% coverage, but it was really skewed between continents, between size classes. Should we say something that the aging target should also, and that's actually something that I think no one ever really worries about. At the moment, as long as 17% are globally achieved, then the rest who cares.
Yeah, I mean, I that is an important point and something that loads of people have commented on, that it's general. So maybe the recommendation. So within this is the recommendation that that quantification is more explicit to deal with representativeness better and geographically, but also ecologically. So we're talking about geography and freshwater.
Yes. And can we have some language about having some emphasis on more strictly protected areas where the species are actually protected? Where fishing is not allowed, as opposed to, like we were saying, simply protecting the landscape and the water, but you still allow the fishery. Because if we're really talking about biodiversity, we need areas where the species cannot be harvested.
So could, okay, I'll be with it. So could we include that as include that with the previous comment about defining the protected area categories better, and so have a recommendation.
Emphasizing the higher categories as the core of any system of freshwater protected areas.
Jörg and then Holly. We're actually 3 minutes over, and I'm probably to wrap. Is there something after this?
No.
Oh, okay.
Microphone anymore. Thank you. I would not especially emphasize overfishing, because I guess this is a minor problem restricted to some areas. I mean, we are experiencing a tsunami of hydropower dams, and there is many people who say that hydropower is the best ecosystem service you can get from a freshwater system. So I would explicitly state hydropowers as a major threat, and water abstraction for various reasons as another major threat, and not to go for overfishing as it is in the marine sector. And I really wonder if the species could not be stronger in, as it is in the American Species Act or something. I well remember this one fish which stopped the dam. I mean, if we have this worldwide with a selected list of species, this would be great, and this would really make a difference then at the spot. Thank you.
I'm not sure whether I'm not sure whether I would really name particular threats like the hydropowers, because it's where does it end? So in Australia, I mean, we recently did an analysis just for a small area in southeast Queensland where land use really was kind of the surrounding land use was one of them. Was more driving than water abstraction and other quality. So I think it really depends on where, and I think it should stay as broad as possible, because otherwise we'll forget one kind of thread, and the people who are really concerned about that get pissed off. And sorry,
I agree that we should not put any specific threat, but we should address the fact, again, back to the strictly protected areas. They should be areas of basically no impact, and they would serve as cores of maybe. We talk about that out of experience, because in the Amazon, the area we work is a mosaic of protected areas, and the core of the protection, after 10 years of strict protection, is so valuable as a baseline, as a baseline for us to compare what's happening around and to be able even to address the fishers, to address the people that are building dams, to address everybody, because we have this baseline to do research and to understand what happens to the ecosystem when it's untouched, and then to have comparisons when it's damaged or overused or whatever. So I think when we talk strictly protected areas for freshwater systems, you're not saying that we should not use sustainable use areas. It's just that we need to focus on having some areas in every system. Some area must be set aside for to be untouched and to serve as baseline for research.
Okay. Harmony, I know you've been waiting a long time. Go ahead.
I just wanted to say I think it could help support our argument that freshwaters should demand more attention to remind everybody that other systems are highly dependent on freshwaters. I mean, anybody who's working on pretty much any terrestrial species or system is going to have, freshwater as an important element of the health and resilience of that system. So it might be good to have some statement about, recognizing the vital role freshwater systems play for wider types of ecosystems.
Okay.
I'm concerned about the more attention, more importance. We can get more importance and still be second-class citizens compared to terrestrial marine. I think really we're shooting that we want equal attention. You look at countries, they have strategies for terrestrial, for marine. How many countries have an equal level strategy for freshwater? The IUCN doesn't, at the national level it doesn't happen. We don't just want more, because we're going to be back here in 10 years and we're going to have a little bit more, but we're still not going to see ourselves on the big screen.
And we have the positive example of South Africa that Dirk presented to you.
Right, yeah. Jorg, okay, and then I think we
Sorry, very short. In Europe, at least, we have quite good experience since a lot of freshwater species are listed in the species list of Natura 2000 trigger species. This really made a difference for conservation in freshwater habitats.
Okay, so I think...
Wait, Virgilio had something to say.
No.
Come
I just wanted to say that we cannot constrain conservation to pristine areas, because there's simply some areas in the world that we don't have pristine systems anymore. So that might be a good example in the Amazon, where you still have some really good areas in really good condition, but that's not the norm anywhere else.
One more point.
And the other thing.
Where the areas that we still can preserve, then we should.
But, yeah,
because you don't have it in Europe doesn't mean that we don't need to have them in the Amazon.
But
because
we
we
also
still
have
pristine areas. We should have keep them pristine.
Anyway.
Oh,
yes.
Okay.
And the other thing that I highlighted yesterday, I think that we really need, that's probably not an IUCN exercise, but we should do it at some point, is to define clear indicators of conservation success, because I'm not sure if people here agree or not, but that area target is not a good indicator of conservation success. We can keep increasing the area protected. Most of rivers protected today, if we do a quick statistic, I'm sure that we might reach that 17% target. That most of it is incidental representation within terrestrial protected areas, which is not good at all, and we all agree on that. So we need to define clear indicators, and once we've got those indicators, we can set targets using those indicators. And I just proposed yesterday that maybe using, I don't know, conservation status of species might be one of them. River health might be another one. So
yeah. Okay. Right. We have to stop. I think the best thing is we can check with the Stream One leaders about how we do this. We can probably draft something and post it up on the Stream One Facebook, and just so people can see it. But we can check up on the process of doing this, just to give people a chance to see it. Thank you very much for all this. This has been extraordinarily helpful. Before you all run off, just a quick announcement, because this is another opportunity to kind of to re-engage with this conversation could very well come up with our the launch of the freshwater chapter of the Managing Protected Areas book that's being produced by WCPA. So on Monday evening at 5:30, and I can't remember the... Oh, okay, and in Hall 4, Pod North, we are launching the freshwater chapter of the book. So please do come along there. We'll have a few sort of short presentations, but an opportunity for a discussion, and that discussion could then be this opportunity to say, we can have something drafted and then say, here's what we think, and then we can kind of refine it. Booyah! Thank you very much.